Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're really getting into the power of storytelling, especially in business.
Sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. We're diving deep into Stories at Work, a book by Indranil Chakraborty.
Okay.
And it's not just about, telling more stories. This book really breaks down WHY stories are so powerful, how they actually work on our brains.
Interesting.
Yeah, and how we can actually use them to get our point across better, build trust, even lead change, all sorts of things.
I'm intrigued. What kind of stuff does it cover?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how it uses actual science to back up its claims.
Okay.
It's not just stories are nice. It's here's the proof.
It's always good to have.
Right. For example, there's this experiment they talk about where they showed people an emotionally moving film.
Okay.
And you know what? Afterwards, people's oxytocin levels were actually higher.
Wow.
I know, right? And guess what else? They were also more likely to donate to charity after watching the film.
So stories can literally change our brain chemistry.
That's what it seems like. Which, makes sense when you think about it. If you hear a bunch of data,
Right.
one part of your brain might be processing it, but a story, it's bam. It activates so many more areas, emotions, memories, sensory details. It's like an experience,
That's such a good point. It's like data tells, but a story shows.
Exactly. And that's why they can be so persuasive. Chakraborty uses this great example of a CEO giving a speech about job security after, a big merger.
Oh, sure.
And the version of the speech that had a personal story woven in, way more reassuring than the one with just data and promises.
That human element makes all the difference.
Absolutely. And you know what else stories do? They build credibility. Take Michael Dell, for example.
Okay.
He has this super simple story about selling stamps as a kid.
I've heard that one.
Right. And it reveals so much about him, his entrepreneurial spirit, his drive. It just makes him more believable.
It's more relatable than just saying, I'm driven.
Yeah, totally. It's like a sneak peek into his personality almost. You get to see the person behind the CEO title.
That's so true.
One thing I found super useful in this book was the part about actually collecting and using stories.
Okay.
They talk about creating a story bank, which I think is brilliant.
I love that idea.
Right. It's like this collection of stories that you can tap into whenever you need one.
Exactly. And Chakraborty emphasizes, capturing the essence of the story, not writing a novel.
Oh, that's good. I was wondering about that.
Take the story of Gillian Lynn. Do you know her?
Refresh my memory.
She choreographed Cats. Amazing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But as a child, she was considered to have a learning disorder because she couldn't sit still.
Really?
But this psychologist saw her dancing at home and realized she just needs to move. So he encourages her to pursue dance and, well, the rest is history.
Wow, what a story. But how would you, store that in your story bank? Do you write out the whole thing?
Not at all. You just jot down the key elements. Gillian Lynn, fidgety, psychologist, dance, cats, just enough to jog your memory.
So it's like a trigger to help you remember the story later.
Exactly. Imagine having a whole collection of these little nuggets ready to weave into any conversation.
It's like having a toolbox full of different stories for different situations. So how do you know which story to use and when?
Well, that's where the book gets even more interesting. It talks about all these different types of stories and how you can use them.
Like what?
For example, there's this thing called the connection story technique. It's all about using short anecdotes to reveal your character and build rapport.
Okay.
Chakraborty actually uses a story from his own life to illustrate this. He talks about how he started a comics circulating library as a kid.
Oh, that's cute.
Right. But it actually reveals a lot about him, like his entrepreneurial inclinations, his love for stories.
Yeah.
Stuff that might not be obvious at first glance.
So it's like a subtle way of saying, hey, we have something in common without actually saying it.
Exactly. It's about creating a human connection before you dive into the details of whatever you're talking about.
That's smart. So it's not just about telling any story. It's about choosing the right story for the right moment.
Exactly. And, the book also talks about story listening, which I think is often overlooked.
Story listening?
Yeah, it's like the flip side of storytelling. It's about being a good listener and drawing stories out of other people.
Oh, okay.
Chakraborty actually gives some great tips on how to do this, like asking open-ended questions, focusing on emotions, and probing for specific examples.
Interesting. So it's like you're not just waiting for your turn to talk, you're actively trying to understand the other person's story.
Exactly. And you'd be surprised what you can learn by just listening.
He even uses an example from his own experience, right? Trying to understand the values of a company he was working with.
Yeah, instead of getting bogged down in all these abstract definitions, he just asked employees to tell him stories about times when those values were actually demonstrated.
How smart. Like, show, don't tell.
Exactly. Stories reveal so much more than just words. They give you insights into people's motivations, beliefs, experiences.
And that can be invaluable, whether you're trying to understand your customers, motivate your employees, or even drive change within your organization.
Absolutely. It's like a secret weapon for building stronger relationships, fostering empathy, and getting things done.
So we've talked about why stories are powerful, how to collect and tell them, and how to listen for them. But can you give me like a concrete example of how stories can be used to drive change?
Absolutely. Chakraborty uses this case study about a global software company that wanted to encourage their engineers to, get this, start selling.
Whoa, big shift.
Right. So instead of just like issuing a mandate, they created this clarity story to explain the change and why it was important.
So they used a story to explain the why behind the change instead of just the what.
Exactly. And they went even further, actually. They knew there might be some pushback, so they proactively shared a success story about an engineer who had already landed a deal.
So it's like they anticipated the resistance and used a story to counter it.
Exactly. They knew stories could help people overcome their doubts and embrace the change.
Brilliant. But with all this talk about the power of stories, it's important to remember that they can also be used unethically, right?
That's a crucial point. And that's actually what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be talking about the importance of ethical storytelling and how to avoid the potential pitfalls of using stories irresponsibly.
Ooh, that's going to be interesting. Can't wait to dive into that.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's a topic that deserves careful consideration.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground talking about how powerful stories can be and how they work on our brains and all that.
Right. We've seen that they can be incredibly persuasive.
Exactly. But like we were just saying before the break, they can also be misused.
Absolutely. And that's where the ethics of storytelling come in, which is a big part of what Chakraborty talks about in this book.
So how do we make sure we're telling stories ethically, especially when it comes to the business?
Well, he starts with this pretty crazy story, actually, about a woman named Samantha as a party.
Okay, who's that?
Well, she basically tricked authorities all over the world with these made-up stories about, like, being a victim.
Really? Like what kind of stories?
Oh, all sorts. Sometimes she'd pretend to be an orphan or a gymnast who'd been trafficked. She even posed as a teenage abuse survivor at one point.
Wow, that's messed up. And people actually believed her.
Yeah, she was super convincing. She even managed to fool, like, experienced investigators, costing various agencies a ton of money.
It's kind of scary how easily people can be drawn into a story, even if it's totally fake.
It's true. And, it all goes back to how our brains are wired, like we were talking about earlier, those emotionally charged stories. They trigger this release of oxytocin in our brains.
Right, which makes us more trusting.
Exactly. And as a party, she basically exploited that biological response.
That's pretty messed up. So how do we make sure we're not doing that, accidentally manipulating people with our stories?
Well, Chakraborty lays out some pretty clear ethical guidelines. He really emphasizes honesty. Like, if you're making up a story, be upfront about it.
Right, don't try to pass it off as true.
Exactly. And always protect people's confidentiality, especially if you're sharing a story about someone else. He even suggests this simple test. If you wouldn't feel comfortable telling the story with the people involved right there in the room with you, then don't tell it.
That's a good one. It really makes you think about the impact your story could have.
Right, and I think it encourages empathy, too, like putting yourself in the shoes of the people in your story.
But what about those times when you need to, tweak a story a little bit, like to make it flow better or to protect someone's identity?
That's where things can get a bit tricky. Chakraborty calls those necessary lies. Sometimes you might change a name or embellish a detail slightly.
I see.
But even then, transparency is key. Like, if you're changing a name, just let your audience know why.
So it's like you're still being honest about the fact that you're changing something.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between using storytelling techniques and staying true to the essence of the story.
Right, because ultimately we want our stories to be impactful, but we also want them to be ethical.
Absolutely. And that's why Chakraborty brings up another really important point.
Yeah.
He talks about this idea of the single story, which is something the writer Chimamanda Adichie talks about a lot.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's about how a single story can create stereotypes and limit our understanding of the world, right?
Exactly. So when we're telling stories, we need to be careful about whose voices are being heard and whose are being left out.
That's a good point. Like, if you're always telling stories about successful white men, for example,
Mhm.
you're missing out on a whole world of experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. So ethical storytelling also means being mindful of power dynamics and actively seeking out diverse voices.
And that makes a lot of sense. So, ethical storytelling isn't just about telling the truth, it's also about being inclusive and aware of the bigger picture.
It is. It's about using this powerful tool responsibly and intentionally.
So, we've talked a lot about telling stories ethically, but what about the book's advice on how to actually use storytelling in business?
Right. Well, he talks about building a storytelling culture within organizations. He emphasizes leadership buy-in. Leaders need to not only support storytelling, but actively model it in their communication.
Okay, that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
walk the talk, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he suggests tailoring training to different parts of the company. It's not one size fits all.
I see what you mean. Like salespeople might need different story skills than marketers, for instance.
Right. It's about making the training relevant and practical. And another thing he recommends is identifying internal storytelling champions.
Storytelling champions, what are those?
It's like finding those people in your organization who are natural storytellers, the ones who everyone loves to listen to,
Oh, okay.
and then empowering them to kind of spread the gospel of storytelling, mentor others and share their tips.
That's a great idea. It's like creating a network of storytellers within the company.
Exactly. And then the last thing he emphasizes is celebrating storytelling successes, making it a regular part of how you communicate.
So instead of just sending out a boring memo about a new policy, maybe you could encourage managers to share stories about how the policy has actually helped people.
Exactly. Or imagine a world where performance reviews involve sharing stories about successes and challenges. That would be so much more engaging.
It's like shifting from a culture of just sharing information to a culture of sharing experience.
Precisely. And that shift can lead to more empathy, better understanding, and ultimately a more connected and engaged workforce.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about telling stories, but what about listening to them?
Yes, story listening.
Hmm.
Chakraborty dedicates a whole chapter to that. He argues that it's just as important as telling stories, especially when it comes to uncovering hidden insights and solving problems.
Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
He shares this case study about a consulting firm that was having trouble with their employee engagement scores.
Yeah.
The scores were going down.
Ouch. Yeah, that's never good.
So they tried the usual stuff like surveys and focus groups, but they couldn't figure out what was going on.
So what did they do?
Well, someone had this brilliant idea. What if we just ask employees to share stories about their experiences related to those low scores?
So instead of just looking at the data, they went straight to the source.
Exactly. And you know what? By listening to those stories, they uncovered all sorts of issues that the surveys had totally missed.
Like what?
For example, one employee told this story about feeling completely disrespected during their performance review. Their manager was constantly on their phone, totally not paying attention.
Oh, wow. That's rough.
Right. But it revealed a lot about the company culture. This lack of attention and respect was probably a big reason why people were feeling disengaged.
So by listening to stories, they were able to identify a specific problem that they could then fix.
Exactly. It's amazing how much you can learn just by listening to people's stories, things that you might never discover through data alone.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that stories can give you a whole different perspective.
They can. And the book gives all sorts of examples of how story listening can be used for different things, like capturing valuable knowledge before someone retires.
Oh, yeah, like that engineer who's been with the company forever and knows everything about how things work.
Exactly. You can get so much wisdom from those people if you just take the time to listen to their stories. It's like preserving institutional memory.
I love that. What else?
Well, he also talks about how story listening can be super powerful for understanding your customers. Instead of just doing traditional market research with all those leading questions.
Right, where you're kind of already pushing people towards a certain answer.
Yeah. Chakraborty suggests approaching customers with genuine curiosity and just letting them tell their stories in their own words.
I like that. It's more about listening than leading.
Exactly. And he has this great story from his own experience as a brand manager. He was working on Lifebuoy soap, and they had this catchy jingle about health. But the consumer research scores on that health attribute were really low, which was confusing.
That doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't people associate soap with health?
So Chakraborty went out into the field and started talking to people. And he met this guy who had never used soap in his life.
Wow, really? Never.
Never. And when he asked him why, the guy just laughed and said, "Son, if life blew meant good health, I'd cut it into pieces and eat it."
Oh my God, that's hilarious, but also kind of sad in a way.
It is. But it was a huge light bulb moment. Chakraborty realized that people weren't understanding the connection between soap and health in the way he thought they were. Like, the guy thought he had to literally eat the soap to be healthy.
So the message wasn't getting through.
Exactly. So they changed their messaging to make it super clear how soap protects you from germs. And guess what? The consumer scores shot up.
So story listening led to real, tangible results. It's not just about collecting feel-good anecdotes.
Not at all. It's about getting real insights that you can use to make things better.
And it's not just about customer insights, right? You can use story listening to build your employer brand, too.
Absolutely. Imagine you're trying to attract new talent. Instead of just saying, "We have a great culture," you can let potential employees hear stories from real people about what it's like to work there.
Yeah, that would be so much more authentic and believable.
It would. Those stories become like little testimonials.
Okay, so story listening can help you attract talent, understand your customers, even improve your company culture. That's pretty impressive.
It is, right? And there's even more. The book goes on to explore how stories can be used in sales, which is something I know a lot of people are interested in.
Oh, definitely. Tell me more about that.
Well, Chakraborty starts by reminding us that people buy you before they buy your product. You have to build that rapport and trust first.
It's all about that human connection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And stories are one of the best ways to do that. They help you reveal your character and your expertise in a way that just resonates with people.
It's like you're not just trying to sell them something, you're inviting them into your world, sharing your experience.
Exactly. And the book gives all sorts of examples of how to use stories in sales to explain complex things, handle objections, and get people excited about your product.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, there's this story about Roslin Chapel in Scotland.
I've heard of that place. It's really old, right?
It is. And it became a huge tourist attraction after it was featured in the Da Vinci Code, that book by Dan Brown.
Oh, yeah, I loved that book.
But the funny thing is, there's no historical evidence to support any of the claims about the chapel in the book. It's totally made up.
So people were flocking to this place based on a fictional story.
Exactly. Which just goes to show how powerful stories can be, even when we know they're not true.
I guess we just love a good story, don't we?
We do. And that's why storytelling can be so effective in sales. If you can tell a compelling story that connects with your customers' needs and desires, you can really elevate your pitch from a boring sales spiel to something memorable and impactful.
It's about making it personal, right? Connecting with the customer on an emotional level.
Exactly. And the book goes even deeper, actually. It talks about different story structures that you can use in your sales presentations to really capture your audience's attention.
Like what?
Well, there's the classic problem-solution narrative, which is always a good one.
Yeah, I've used that one before. You start by outlining a problem your customer is facing, and then you present your product as the solution.
Exactly. It's simple but effective.
Yeah.
He also talks about more complex structures like the monomyth or hero's journey.
I've heard of that. It's that classic story arc where the hero goes on an adventure, faces challenges, and ultimately triumphs in the end, right?
Exactly. And you can use that same structure in a sales context.
How so?
Imagine you're selling software that helps businesses streamline their operations. You could frame the customer as the hero who's embarking on this journey to overcome the challenges of inefficiency and complexity. Your software becomes the magic tool that helps them achieve their goals.
Oh, I see. It's like you're giving them a role to play in their own success story.
Precisely. It's about creating a narrative that's engaging and inspiring.
That's a great idea.
The power of storytelling is truly amazing.
It is, but sometimes I struggle to connect storytelling with data. Like, I know they can work together, but I'm not always sure how.
I hear you. A lot of people feel that way. But luckily, the book has a whole chapter dedicated to storytelling with data.
Okay, good. Because I need help with that.
Well, Chakraborty makes this really important point. Data by itself is often meaningless. It's the story we weave around that data that gives it life and makes it relevant.
Like that saying, numbers don't lie, but liars use numbers. It's all about how you interpret the data.
Exactly. And he gets some amazing examples of how data storytelling has been used to uncover hidden truths, spark change, even save lives.
Wow. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me one of those stories.
Well, there's this story about a statistician named Ben Wellington. He used public parking ticket data to expose this weird inconsistency in New York City.
What do you mean?
He noticed that there were 2 fire hydrants with a crazy high number of parking tickets, like way more than any other hydrants in the city.
That's suspicious.
So he looked at those spots on Google Street View, and it turned out the parking spaces near those hydrants were marked as legal. And there was even a bike lane separating the parking spaces from the hydrants.
So people were getting ticketed for parking legally.
It seems like it. The city had designated those spots as parking spaces, but the NYPD was still ticketing people. Wellington's data storytelling brought that to light, and the city eventually fixed the problem.
So data storytelling can actually make a real difference in the world.
It can. And he also talks about Dr. John Snow, who used data storytelling to figure out what was causing cholera outbreaks back in the 1850s.
I vaguely remember learning about that in school. Wasn't it something about bad air?
That's what people thought at the time, yeah. But Snow wasn't so sure. So he started mapping out where the cholera cases were happening. And by weaving a narrative around that data, he was able to pinpoint a contaminated water pump as the source of the outbreak.
Wow, so his data storytelling literally saved lives.
It's a powerful example of how data isn't just about numbers. It's about people, stories, and making a difference.
I'm starting to see that. It's like the data gives you the facts, but the story gives you the meaning.
Exactly. And the book gives some really practical tips for telling stories with data, like how to find the human element in the data, how to choose the right visualizations, how to create a narrative that people will actually care about.
It's about making the data come alive.
Yeah, and that's where storytelling really shines.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from the science of storytelling to the ethics to the practical applications. My brain is full.
Me too. It's been a really fascinating deep dive.
But there's still one more crucial piece of the puzzle we need to talk about: the ethics of storytelling.
Right. That's something we definitely can't ignore.
So before the break, we were talking about the importance of ethical storytelling.
Right. Because as we've seen, stories can be super persuasive, but that power comes with responsibility.
Exactly. And this book, it doesn't shy away from that at all. In fact, Chakraborty kicks off this chapter with a pretty disturbing story.
Yeah, the one about Samantha Azzopardi, right?
Yeah, the woman who tricked authorities all over the world with these elaborate lies about being a victim.
It's crazy how she managed to fool so many people for so long.
I know. It really makes you think about how vulnerable we can be to a well-told story.
Especially one that triggers our emotions. Remember, we talked about how those emotionally charged stories can release oxytocin in our brains, making us more trusting and susceptible to manipulation.
Right. So in a way, she was kind of exploiting that biological response.
It seems like it. Which is why it's so important to be aware of the ethical implications of storytelling.
So how do we make sure we're using stories for good and not for, tricking people?
Well, Chakraborty offers some really helpful guidelines. Like, first and foremost, be honest.
Okay, that seems like a good place to start.
Right. Don't try to pass off a made-up story as true. And if you're sharing a story about someone else, always protect their confidentiality.
Right, don't betray their trust.
Exactly. And he even suggests this really simple test. Ask yourself, would I feel comfortable telling this story if the people involved were sitting right here in the room with me?
Ooh, that's a good one. It really makes you think twice.
It does. It forces you to consider the potential impact of your story on others.
But what about those times when you might need to, tweak a story a little bit, like to make it flow better or to protect someone's identity?
That's where it gets a little more nuanced. He talks about these things called necessary lies.
Necessary lies.
Yeah, like maybe you change a name to protect someone's privacy, or you slightly embellish a detail to make the story more engaging.
Okay, I can see how that might be necessary sometimes.
But even then, transparency is key. If you're changing something, be upfront about it. Let your audience know.
So it's like you're still being honest about the fact that you're making a change, even if it's a small one.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between using storytelling techniques and respecting the truth.
Makes sense. So it's not just about telling a good story, it's about telling the right story in the right way.
Exactly. And that's where the whole idea of the single story comes in.
Oh yeah, we touched on that earlier. It's that idea that a single story can create stereotypes and limit our understanding of the world, right?
Exactly. So as storytellers, we need to be mindful of whose voices we're amplifying and whose voices might be getting left out.
Right. Like if we're only telling stories about a certain type of person or experience, we're not giving the full picture.
Exactly. And we might even be perpetuating harmful stereotypes without even realizing it.
So ethical storytelling also means being inclusive and considering different perspectives.
It does. It's about using our stories to build bridges, not walls.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about storytelling, not just as a technique, but as a responsibility.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive.
So as we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think it's this. Stories are incredibly powerful. They can inform, inspire, persuade, and even heal. But we need to use that power wisely and ethically.
I love that. So to our listeners, we challenge you. Start paying attention to the stories you're telling and the stories you're hearing. And ask yourself, how can you use the power of storytelling to make a positive impact in your own life and in the world around you?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.